Good evening. Today is Friday, August 15th. It is the date that Richard Nixon famously brought down the Bretton Woods system by decoupling the dollar from the gold reserve system, something Lyndon LaRouche forecast prior to it happening. And it is also the day of the Putin-Trump summit in Anchorage, Alaska. Richard Freeman and I are recording this a couple hours perhaps before the end of that summit, and if there's more, we will fill you in. But I wanted to actually take up the Bering Strait tunnel, the question of a new security architecture, and some of the things going into the summit, which have been said particularly by Russia, which has been very clear from the beginning of the conflict what the issues were, what the root causes were. And there was a paper posted this morning on RT by a prominent Russian thinker of the Valdai Club, who stressed that what he hopes will be addressed or that can be finally taken up is what happened around the reunification of Germany and the need for a new security architecture as a result, which never was addressed. Remember that it's now been proven and documented that James Baker III promised Gorbachev that NATO would not move 1 inch to the east. And in fact, NATO has expanded wildly, about 1,000 kilometers, and several new nations. And you can imagine if the same thing were done surrounding the United States, that we might feel somewhat threatened by this. So I will say that the most important thing is that the dialogue is occurring. I wouldn't expect that this first discussion will immediately lead to a cessation of hostilities. I think the Western press coverage saying that Donald Trump wants a ceasefire is frankly a setup. It's a setup of Trump to try and say that he failed if a ceasefire has not been agreed to at this meeting. And of course, how could you? Because ultimately Zelensky is going to have to agree to something, even if Russia does not recognize him, and in my opinion, correctly, as the legitimate president of Ukraine, since he canceled the elections and has been in there unconstitutionally not elected. But nonetheless, as everyone in the world knows, the US, the UK, NATO are the ones telling Zelensky what to do, and a few of our rogue US senators, namely people like Lindsey Graham and Richard Blumenthal of Connecticut. So what I would like to do is give people some food for thought about the productive cooperation between Russia and the United States that is possible. And I would say that everybody should look at the International Peace Coalition meeting of earlier today, where there were quite some intense disagreements. One of the guests invited by Helga LaRouche was Avram Berg, the former speaker of the Israeli Knesset, formerly the head of a World Zionist organization, who nonetheless believes that Israel is committing war crimes and atrocities, although he wouldn't use the word genocide, which led to quite some anger from others, but also Richard Falk, who was the Palestinian Special Rapporteur at the United Nations for many years. And I would encourage people to watch this dialogue and listen to how Helga LaRouche navigated and attempted to bring everybody's thinking to a higher level. Because frankly, if we cannot have a dialogue with those with whom we disagree, then we are going to be forced to say that mankind is never going to stop having wars as a means of resolving disputes. And as we know, wars don't actually work very well to that end. So without saying more, I'm going to bring in Richard Freeman of the Economics Desk of Executive Intelligence Review, longtime associate of Lyndon LaRouche, who's done a number of economic studies on matters of physical economy and infrastructure, and will be talking to us about this incredible project, which really would change the world, the Bering Strait tunnel. So please, Rich, go ahead and welcome.
Thank you. Thanks, Diane. As I often say, but it's completely true. I totally enjoy being on the show. The discussion is always great in terms of when we have dialogue and so forth. I would say right now that what we're looking at and we're going to see is a little space, no more than 70 miles, separating the Western Hemisphere from the Eastern Hemisphere, up in the Bering Strait, where Alaska faces directly to Russia. So why should a 70-mile strait have such significance for the world? And why is it something that Lyndon LaRouche spoke so repeatedly about, and Helga LaRouche on the International Peace Coalition meeting today addressed as a pivot for what can be accomplished? And I think at this point, we have to just think in terms of physical economy. And by physical economy, I mean not just how many bricks you make, but how do you transform the entire world and all the economies in it, including the United States, from taking strategic decisions at critical moments of history that build certain things, which while they may seem small, are actually gigantic in what they do to the economy, but also, and this is very important, gigantic in freeing up the thinking of mankind, so that once you do one of these, you can think about doing 2, 5, 10, 100, and we're no longer in the constrictions of a monetarist era and a collapsing financial system or intimidation by nuclear war as we intend to end it. So I will say that by way of lead-in, I was not able to see the whole IPC meeting, but I was able to see Helga LaRouche, and she said something very provocative at the very beginning in her opening. She said, look, we want to, these are my words, end the war, the NATO proxy war in Ukraine, which is, Diane just said, is really not a single act, but part of a process going on over a number of years of NATO just marching to the east and wanting to plant its flag in Ukraine with nuclear weapons. The key thing she said is that this will connect all the continents. That's excellent. But the war itself, which must be solved within the terms of a more normalized relations between the U.S. and Russia, may not be, war avoidance, as critical as it is, may not be the lead item on the agenda, or if I didn't get the words wrong, or at least the only major item on the agenda. Because really, what's on the agenda, aside from certain nuclear arms treaties, is this question of how can we take raw materials from different parts of the world, build flows across the whole world, and develop so that the world becomes a one. And if the world becomes a one and can function as a one, this is the greatest path to breakout. And in my words, it will transform everything about the U.S.-Russian relationship and should change at least what U.S. and Russia can do together to stop what is going on among certain Western European countries who still are on the line of nuclear war. So I'm going to look at a few things, and I'd like to present. Yes, begin with, this is from Lyndon LaRouche. And this is from May 4th, 2007 EIR, but it's actually from a conference which we'll learn about in the discussion here. And this is called Mendeleev Would Have Agreed. The intention to create a trans-Siberian rail system implicitly extended across the Bering Strait to North America dates implicitly from the visit of Dmitry Ivanovich Mendeleev to the 1876 U.S. Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia, the defeat of Lord Palmerston's scheme for destroying the United States by U.S. President Abraham Lincoln's leadership spread the influence of what was called the American system of political economy into Russia, as also the German reforms under Bismarck, the industrialization of Japan, and elsewhere. This requires the creation of long-term agreements among nations, creating a new system of relatively fixed exchange rate treaty agreements at very low prime interest rates over forward-looking intervals of between a quarter to half a century. We have thus entered a time measured by the clock of nuclear fission and thermonuclear powers development, when the long history of the domination over the land masses of the planet by actually or implicitly imperial maritime powers is no longer an acceptable practical proposition. Instead, the science-driven, capital-intensive mode of development of the basic economic infrastructure and standard of living of the populations will dominate any successful form of civilized development of relationship among the sovereign nations of the planet. To this end, the tundras and deserts of our planet must be conquered by the forces of science-driven technological development of the increased productive powers of labor. Development must now proceed from the Arctic rim southwards towards Antarctica. The bridging of the Bering Strait becomes thus now the navel of a new birth of a new world economy. Now, let me just locate this within the World Land Bridge, and you'll see in this updated version of the World Land Bridge, all the critical projects, many others, of course, hundreds of others, which we've documented in the New Silk Road becomes the World Land Bridge. But you'll see number one is the Bering Strait. You'll see its physical location up at the top. You'll then see number two, the Oasis Plan, the Trans-Aqua Plan for bringing massive water transfer in Africa and ending the lack of water, underdevelopment, and so forth. Number four, the Nawapa, which we'll see. Number five, U.S. Rail. Number six, the Chankay Port, which is connected very closely with number seven, the Bi-Oceanic Corridor, which will go straight across Iberoamerica from the Atlantic to Pacific and free up Brazil, Peru, Bolivia, and other countries for the development of the entire Ibero-American Peninsula. So that's where we're going to locate the Bering Strait, this tiny little distance of 70 miles, right? About 115 kilometers. And if you can look here, you'll see it. So Chukotka is in Russia, and you'll see Alaska, of course. And then you'll see it says the Diomede Islands. And that's the small Diomede, which you really can't even see, which is under the United States, let's say, oversight, part of the United States. And then to its left is the large Diomede. We're going to see this in a second, which is under Russia's control. And you will see next, and it's connecting through the Diomede Islands, which are going to play a very, very critical role, which, by the way, you cannot cross from one to the other. I mean, under the current tense situations existing that have been created against the United States and Russia, you cannot cross from one little island, which is only 2.54 miles from the other. Because not only is that where the international date line goes through, but this is a separation of the world, going back to Winston Churchill's so-called Cold War. Now, I want to show three things. One is some of the plans that have gone into the development of this Bering Strait. We are not the first, not now, nor 10 years ago, nor 20 years ago, to think of developing this. And there have been many, many thinkers. I'm not going to only be able to touch on two, but I could list literally 15 to 20 who have thought of this process. One of them is very interesting. You won't see it as well, but this is a map produced by William Gilpin, who I'll say is in a second. And you'll see the Bering Strait up at the very top between Russia and the United States as connected. And it's titled, this is his title of a book that he published in 1890, The Cosmopolitan Railroad, Compacting and Fusing Together All the World's Continents. This is an 1890 book. Now, this is Gilpin, and he was a strong supporter of President Abraham Lincoln. And Lincoln made him the first governor of the Colorado Territory in 1861-1862. And he saw Colorado as a key connecting point for the development of the United States rail system, which was followed through in 1863 with the Transcontinental Railroad. But he had an idea that was broader than that. And this is from his book, Compacting and Fusing Together All the World's Continents. The idea forced itself more and more upon my mind of a widely extended railway system. This system should not only traverse the North American continent from sea to sea, but should continue its source north and west across the Bering Strait and across Siberia to connect with the railways of Europe and all the world. In the consummation of the grand scheme of a cosmopolitan railway will be forged another link in the great chain of progress. And then he talks about what's one of the critical forces, quote, the elevation of mind and the immortality of man's intelligence, end quote, is a critical force. So 1890, and he actually proposed this in an 1859 book, but he elaborated it more. Now, a second thing I want to cite, and there was a 1906 conference, the Tsar was proposing building Bering Strait at one point. This was following through the magnificent work of Count Witte to build the Trans-Siberian Railroad, which was done with the United States, very heavily with the United States. And I wanted to say at this point, the United States, going back to John Quincy Adams and before, with the Russian support of the League of Armed Neutrality, which was critical force in the American Revolution, in giving support to the United States, or the colonies at that point, to survive international intervention by any other countries at that point, namely Britain, of course, which they intervened, but to give some support. This, since 1776 and since actually the 1600s, the United States has never had a war with Russia. We've had wars with Britain, we've had wars with Germany, so forth and so on. We never had one. And until Operation Unthinkable of 1945, with a brief exception earlier, we were never pitted against Russia. And we never followed that policy. That's our natural policy. That's not an artificial policy. That's a policy that goes on for at least 250 years. And I know you have to make a mental flip to think in those terms, but those terms are absolutely critical. We will be returning to the positive relations that we have had. So let me go to the next one, please. Another thing I'll just cite, and this is a conference in which Lyndon LaRouche was not able to attend, but his paper was presented, which I just cited at the beginning on Mendeleev. It was a April 24th, 2007 Moscow conference called Mega Projects of Russia's East, a transcontinental Eurasia link via the Bering Strait. And I'm just showing you the pictures of some people there whose names you will not immediately connect, but who are major people and whom Helga and Lyndon LaRouche have worked with through the years. One of them is Alexander Gronberg, who was the head of what the Russians call the Russian Academy of Sciences Council of the Study of Productive Forces, or SOPS. So they study productive forces. By the way, where did that come from? That was a continuation of the organization that Vernadsky had run earlier in the 20th century in Russia. And on the right is Dr. Viktor Razbegin, who is also attached to that, as well as the Ministry of Transport. They both presented papers along with Lyndon LaRouche. And another person in the middle is Walter Hickel. And Hickel is a remarkable person. He was twice governor of Alaska. He helped create the state of Alaska in 1959. He gave EIR an interview in which he said the only thing lacking for building the Bering Strait tunnel, which he is a major proponent of, is the political will to do it. So that's a conference. We can go through many, many other things that fed into this project. I just want to center on two other things. Can we build this in time? Will this be a timeless project? Will it always be on the table? Well, what I'm showing you now, if you look at that red wiggly line that goes from the United States into Alaska, that is the 1,500-mile Alaskan highway. And it has been talked about and talked about. And after Pearl Harbor, which was December 7th, 1941, the Japanese continued to attack the United States. If you look at Alaska, you'll see going out into the Pacific from the bottom are what are called the Aleutian Island chains. And in early 1942, the Japanese bombed one of the islands, killing over 100 Americans. So we needed two things at that point in the United States. We needed to be able to get goods into Alaska, partly to send them for our own protection, military goods, and we also needed goods to send to Russia under the Lend-Lease program. So on March 9th, 1942, President Roosevelt, who had wanted to build this since 1936 when he was president, said, I am now putting together 10,000 men from the Army Corps of Engineers, 1/3 of whom will be African American, who are unfortunately still segregated in separate troop formations, but who played a major role in this. And we're going to build this. And the United States built it in less than 8 months because we were determined to do it. It was unveiled on November 20th, 1942. And it was started March 9th, 1942. You can do the math and figure out. And I located it not just in the United States. I want you to see where it looks in terms of the world.
Rich, wait. Can I ask you, what is the status of that railroad today?
Well, it was a highway. It wasn't a railroad.
Highway.
Yes.
And
well, I'm going to show.
Using it?
Yes. Well, here's what happened. It was built, Diane, very primitively, but quickly. And I'll say what I mean by primitively. If you look at that picture, you'll see they moved, I don't know, 2,000, 3,000 earth-moving equipments, things to run cement, things to do. They were all shipped up. They were dropped into this area, and we built this beginning at different levels. So this is a Caterpillar tractor with dozer. It widened the roadway. It just widened the roadway. Now, one of the things we had to do to make this work is that you have two different things in Alaska and in Russia. And so therefore, the Russians and Americans know these problems. One is called tundra. That's where the earth is frozen. Another is called permafrost, where the earth is temporarily frozen, then turns into mud. So when it was temporarily mud, they cut down trees, and they called this corduroy. They laid them across the road and literally put cement up on top of them because this thing was going to be built. And this thing, and I'll tell you now the status, this is the soldiers of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers meeting in the middle after they completed the construction of the Alaska Highway in September. That was a very rough road, to answer your question, for years and years and years. It has now been paved, slightly shortened, because at that time when they couldn't get past a certain impediment, they simply built the road around it. They said, we're going to have this road. We're in war. But, you can do things with the same intention as if you were in war when you're in peace. That's the critical point we've learned time and again. So they repaved the highway, shortened it, and it is now an existing highway. It's a functioning highway. It only goes so far into Alaska, and that's going to be one of our questions that we have to deal with to widen out the Bering Strait thing. So it's a magnificent achievement. It's just 1,500 miles in 8
months. Yeah, 8 months. Forget it. Now you can't, the New York City 2nd Avenue subway took 10 years. I don't even know if it's 2 miles long. That is just amazing.
They can't even fix potholes on the Riverside Drive or the West Side Highway. I mean, well, we'll get to it with over the next year and a half. No, this is when you're determined. That's why I'm saying it's so important to take your people's mind and use this Bering Strait and this, which could be adopted. And if it's not adopted today, it could be adopted in the next few weeks. One of the key people who is at this conference, he is Kirill Dmitriev. He is the head of the Development Fund of Russia. He's also been one of the chief negotiators. He went on the air on August 10th and talked about the conference. And our Daniel Burke said, how about building the Bering Strait? And he said, this is Dmitriev. He's one of the key negotiators. Yes, that's a possibility. This is in the Russians. They know this process. Stalin wanted to build this. He called up Truman, and Truman said no, because the Cold War had started.
Right.
Okay, so the other thing I just want to show is, which I didn't, I put towards the back here, but I just want to bring this up. Now, this is it's not the greatest picture, but it's the Trans-Siberian Railroad, which was built from 1892, I believe, till 1915. And you can see on the very left Moscow, but you might not be able to read the other ones. But in the pink, in the very right, facing out onto the Pacific Ocean, in the lower right is Vladivostok, which is part of the whole Russian Far East. Now, this, I just want to cite something, and it really is gives you a sense, again, because this is so important in changing the U.S.-Russia relationship. This was built with American equipment, the Baldwin Locomotive Factory, between 1892 and 1900, shipped almost 500 American locomotives to Siberia to be able to build this. This was the brainchild of Count Witte, Sergei Witte, who was a really an exceptional person. It was his plan, and he carried this out as the finance minister from 1892 to 1903, and he had other positions. And he was a follower of Friedrich List. I mean, an ardent follower of Friedrich List in the American system. But just to give you a sense of how this was built, what was called the Pressed Steel Company, which was in Pittsburgh, produced a lot of the freight cars and freight car bodies. The Pittsburgh-based Westinghouse Electric and Manufacturing produced air brakes and the electrical apparatus. The Maryland Steel Company, which later became Bethlehem Steel of Sparrows Point, Maryland, produced the rail bridges, which became the standard rail bridges for the rail lines. And then machine tools were produced in Cincinnati, Ohio, Schenectady, New York, Pittsburgh, where they manufacture stationary engines and other equipment. This was a collaborative project, and it's a magnificent project because it united Russia from east to west. The paradigm for it was, of course, the American Transcontinental Railroad. It was built by the Russians, but this was something America worked with Russia to do. As I said, this is the normal relations. There's so many other things that could be cited, but we're not going to do that here. So to go back to now what this looks like. So we're now at, one last thing, which is a very fun thing. There's something called the Marmary Tunnel, which was built in 2013. And it's an 8.4 mile tunnel beneath the Bosphorus Strait in Turkey. And it connects Asia with Europe. And I just want you to see what these tunnels look like. This is 8.4 miles. We're talking 70 miles, almost 8 times larger. But this is connecting Asia with Europe. We're going to connect the Western Hemisphere with the Eastern Hemisphere with all the things that can be done. So this is what it looks like. You'll see Chukchi Peninsula and Seward Peninsula. And then there's the Diomede Islands. It's named after a Greek figure who led 80 ships during the Trojan War for the Argives. That's another picture that just gives you a perspective of it, just so you get the physical settings and bearings, and that's the one I showed you earlier. So how are we going to do this? Now, I want to introduce you to Hal Cooper, who was a tremendous person. He was also at the other conference, but he has a special place in the hearts of us in the LaRouche organization because he was just a phenomenal person. He was not even a rail engineer. He was a chemical engineer, PhD, but he He taught himself civil engineering and he taught himself rail engineering. And here he presented in a paper called A World Rail Network to End the British Imperial System. He did this at a 2010 conference, Schiller Institute conference in Berlin. So now we're going to get into some of the specifics because we're going to build this. And this is what Howe said. Now, when we build a tunnel, he's talking about Bering Strait Tunnel, we build it through a combination of granite and limestone. That is the base of what's underneath in the Bering Strait. It's relatively easy to dig. It's just that the rock is generally hard, and it's going to take some time. But we would put it about 100 feet below the water level, and the water would be about 60 to 70 meters deep, or 100 to 80 to 200 feet. So 200 feet is the depth of the water. We're going to build it 100 feet below, so 300 feet. There are two islands in the middle, Little Diomede on the United States side and Big Diomede on the Russian side. There are 200 people, Native Americans, who live on Little Diomede. That's the American side. Big Diomede is a weather station, a military base with Russia. So that's how you're going to start it. Now, these are development corridors, and I just want to show you because what this is a development corridor. It's under the water, but it's a development corridor. So what's going to happen? Let me go to the next one. You can see this is a drawing that Howe, one of the people who worked with Howe for many, many years, he would do drawings for Howe. You'll see rail entering and exiting what would be the Bering Strait Tunnel. And there's something you could see looking like in the third chamber. Actually, that chamber will be a work chamber. And it will, when you get to Little Diomede, you will have vented air go beneath into the system. And things will be uploaded and offloaded into this third chamber. And then when you get to, it will go 2.4 miles to Big Diomede. Same thing, air will be vented in. You will have production facilities, some of them built perhaps on the island. And then it will go across the rest of the Bering Strait. I will just say one thing right now. When you do this, it's going to take real U.S.-Russian collaboration, just like the Soyuz and Apollo when they had the handshake in space in 1975, the first time any two foreign nations' space vehicles had docked together and then enjoyed operations together. And it was a magnificent development in a period of extreme Cold War. I would build two more lines. I would build two more tunnels. I would just throw them out. I don't know anyone in the world will listen to me because after a while, these will be electric high-speed rail. That is, they will be totally electrified. They will not use diesel fuel. 99% of the American system uses diesel fuel to then power an electric generator. It's completely inefficient and is silly. But I would build two separate chambers for maglev so that when we get to that point, we don't have to dive down again and rebuild this, but plan on actually having a maglev line. How Cooper was thinking of building a maglev line entirely. Question or no?
No, I just want to be here because I think I'm going to have questions.
Yeah.
This is very exciting. Go ahead.
And so this is something from one of our publications. It just says high-speed lines are not simply a practical way to get people and goods from here to there. These new rail corridors will become corridors of development, concentrating people and resources from the most efficient utilization of basic economic infrastructure, thus raising the living standards and productive powers of labor of each individual. New major cities, zones of agriculture, and smaller municipalities concentrated along the roughly 60-mile wide corridors, that's 60 miles on either side of your rail system, will benefit from the higher platforms of infrastructure in these regions, creating a chain of productive centers from north to south, east to west. So this will be an east to west corridor. This means all of Alaska, Arctic Canada will be changed. This means the Russian Far East and Siberia will be changed. China, which is south of Russia, will be changed. The two Koreas will be changed. That's what you're doing in this thing. It's and this is a project.
There's one other I just wanted to bring up because it struck me the other day, and I think it's extremely important, especially when you see the disgusting role being played by Starmer, Macron, and Friedrich Merz in these attempts to get to peace and normal relations between the US and Russia. If you're traveling this way, you don't have to go through Western Europe. You don't have to deal with those people. And I'm not saying we wouldn't want to, or they wouldn't be inspired and swept in, but isn't it much better to have an unmediated direct corridor to Russia and Asia from the United States?
And vice versa.
Yes.
Because if what Putin has kept saying is we have to develop the Eurasian space, he calls it, by which he means parts of the what we call the Middle East or Southwest Asia, all of the Central Asia, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, so forth, Afghanistan, then China, India, ASEAN. That will connect all of their product to the United States if we can swing Trump. And Trump has a sketchy history as to what he was as a businessman. But as Helga said, look, he understands some construction and he understands trade. This is a deal that is so pregnant with possibilities.
Not to mention hotels.
Right. He can have a Trump Plaza, in Kamchatka. I mean, you could do, of course. But no, it will, because I'll show what you're going to do with the population. It's totally going to transform the population. And the key thing is when you run it into Europe, as Helga has pointed out, if we build a strait underneath the Mediterranean, it will go right into Africa. And you could go basically through Southwest Asia, keep in the southern part of Europe, and go straight into, or you could use the Messina, where you could go straight into Africa. All the continents are merged. We are one in many, many senses. So absolutely correct. And it also would mean that the congestion at the Long Beach and Los Angeles port and the Seattle port, you would be sending these things through a water transport, which is less efficient, more costly, takes longer. This will cut by at least half moving goods if we did this, by half to up to 70% if you wanted to move goods from, say, St. Louis, Missouri to Irkutsk, Russia, and so forth. It just changes time, space. Okay, now I've shown you the little spot. The other part I just want to concentrate is this. There's a hole in this. So this is a map, and it shows the magnificent. You can go from New York up in the upper right-hand corner of the United States and clear across to Paris. However, you'll see dash, 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 dash lines. And this is what Hal Cooper, and I worked with Hal on this, and he mentored me on a lot of this work. But what happened is you see Fort Nelson, and Fort Nelson to Cape Wales, which is the most extremest tip of the peninsula of the United States of Alaska, up there, not a peninsula, but of Alaska, before it crosses over into what's called Uelun or Dazhnev in Russia. That's a distance of 3,030 miles, and It's empty. And unless you plan to go by dog sled and carry your goods, and yell, mush, 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 you're not going to get there. So what do you have to do? So the next thing we did is, this is something, I'm sorry I can't make it larger, but this is a thing that Hal had always been thinking of, but I worked with him on it, and under his instruction, I drew the map. But if he had to, it was his. We would have conversation for 2 or 3 hours and do it 2 or 3 times a week. I mean, this took work because you have to figure out how you're going to grade it, the land, where you want to go to, what's the most efficient way of dealing this. You have to figure out certain things about the topology. You just don't plunk down the railroad. But this is a railroad which will begin in Prince George and go all the way up. If you go all the way up the tip, it'll go through Fairbanks, and it will go through Nome all the way up to the Bering Strait. Now, this is a railroad with 3,030 miles. And there are other railroads. There's one from Alberta to, it's called the Alberta-Canada Railroad, but it doesn't go past Fort Nelson, so it's got a problem. But there are things that are being done by different people who have looked into this. So What does that mean? Well, this is what's very interesting. You can develop a bill of materials. So for every ton required of double track, because you just don't want to have one line and then everybody has to go off into a spur line for one train to pass another. It has to be double track. It has to be electric. And this was from work that Hal had worked on principally. For every double tracked electric line, this is what you need in terms of tons. 60 tons of construction lumber. You can see railroad ties, railroad bars, reinforcing rails, railroad rails, reinforcing bars, major bridges. And that's assuming that there's 15,500 tons of steel in 1 mile of railroad bridge, cement, aggregate, copper wire, and so forth. Now multiply that by 3,030 miles. So we're not just going to build there, which will build probably 15 to 25,000 jobs in Alaska. And I want to say, you have to decide between Russia and America. What, for example, if you're going to use boring machines, you have to use the same ones or have the exact precise same boring diameters. Otherwise, it's not going to work. You have to use other things. Who's going to manage this equipment? Who's going to do that equipment? It will be genuine collaboration, just like in space.
It seems like that highway is going to have to carry an awful lot of weight.
Yes. Yes, but its problem is that it had never been extended. I mean, this is Alaska. It's virtually, if you want to talk about the underdevelopment of places in the world, it is one of the most underdeveloped areas, 600,000 square miles. But absolutely right. That highway is going to have to be put to a lot of work, and we're going to need boats to do it, and we're going to need equipment, perhaps, well, mostly those two modes of transportation. So now, let me just give you one sense of this. And the same is true in Russia. I just did these figures for Alaska. So Alaska has 1 person per square mile. But in the Yukon territory, which is in Canada, is 0.16. British Columbia is 1.23. Give you a sense of that. Look at Ohio, 277 people per square mile. Netherlands, over 1,000. This thing just doesn't have people. So we're going to populate it. We're going to develop it just like we would develop the Sahara. These figures for the Russian Far East, which is a gigantic zone. Russian Far East would consume, it's 3 time zones, but it would consume about 60% of all America. And the Russians have been trying to develop it and develop it and develop it. This will allow them to do it. But they have population densities of which I think are fairly similar to this. I just didn't have time to put them together. So we're going to build people. Now, I showed you the American side. I just want to show you, this is still the Trans-Siberian Railway. This thing is in Russian, but you can see that the Trans-Siberian Railroad, if you're not totally colorblind like myself, is in red. And then you'll see the Baikal-Amur main line, which is called the BAM. You'll see it's in green. It's in the more eastern portion of Russia. And then you'll see a little what's orange-yellow, and it's the Amur Yakuts or Yakutia. And that line, which is very significant, and these were great projects, goes all the way up to Yakuts. But to get from the Russian side to where you would do, it's the little town, what's called Uelen, Uelen, you're going to need another 2,000 miles. So to go back to this thing, we need to build over 5,000 miles. We can do it. So this will also stimulate the development of the underdeveloped sections of these countries simultaneously. But Hal has often said, and I just want to show it, what it will also involve in the United States is Hal said at the same paper that I quoted from before, because he talks about many concepts. I just quoted it. I wanted to give something so people could see the physical requirements of building this. He said that you would be built simultaneously with the North American Water and Power Lines, and you will see that they very much parallel each other because they both go up to Alaska, and you take the water from the Yukon and the Mackenzie Rivers basins, and you send it down. We won't go through it here. We've done presentations of this. But he sees these as joint projects that you would do simultaneously. Let me also say, aside from sending goods back and forth, we're going to send natural gas, which you could put down to very, very cold levels so that you could send it by superconductivity. Superconductivity that will form it like liquid natural gas, but it'll even be more compressed. We're going to send electricity, fiber optic lines through the Bering Strait tunnels. These are going to be not just lines for the rail. The other thing, and I just want to show this is a project that Hal put forth the first 26,000 miles, and he had me work with him to take it up to 42,000 miles. We have a rail system in America, but which has to be linked, which we're just showing where it has to be linked to get up to Alaska. But we need to build high-speed rail and maglev. So it's going to call forth, it's going to cry out for, it's going to provoke finally building this U.S. network of 42,000 miles. So, and it will do so with every country that it touches, and also where the Chankay port is, and also what Transaqua is. Now you get a sense of what we're really doing through these little 70 miles. So this, by the way, is just for the high-speed rail network, which we worked on, connecting many, many cities, all the major cities in America, and it will have freight connections as well. The high-speed rail will go at about 250 to 300 miles per hour, and the high-speed freight will go at about 100 to 120 miles per hour. Each of these, the requirements for this 42,000 miles of high-speed rail, which will replace some of our rail, 10,000 locomotives, 100 power substations. You can see how much steel, cement, how many gigawatts of power production. We will need something like 50 nuclear plants to do that. This is Hal presenting his plan, and you'll see he's laughing and Helga's laughing. And this is a drawing he presented to her at the 2007 Schiller Institute conference with his concept for the Bering Strait Tunnel. Now, I want to close with something that Helga's in her letter, the open letter to Donald Trump and President Vladimir Putin. And don't be surprised, that's a bad way of putting it. Be encouraged if something comes out of this thing. It's obviously going to take up New START, I would think. It has to take up the question of the INF Treaty. We have to establish firm relations. It's not a matter of a line of battle between Russia and China and Russia and Ukraine. Core security means, of course, getting rid of the Nazis out of Ukraine, but it means you have to start taking the larger issues of the world. So this is Helga's letter, and I think everyone should use this, send it to people, and we have a call. President Donald Trump and President Vladimir Putin, and she CC'd this to Xi Jinping, President Xi Jinping of China. When you were meeting in Alaska on August 15th, the fate of humanity lies in your hands. The war in Ukraine, when you are meeting in the fate of humanity lies in your hands. Against all the attempts by the opponents of peace, you can not only bring an end and with it eliminate the sword of Damocles of the nuclear extinction of the human species, at least over this conflict, but you can also reintroduce diplomacy into the relation of the two most powerful nuclear nations on Earth. It seems to repeat itself, unfortunately. I'm sorry about that. But she adds, but there is something even more elevated you can do. But not only fighting off the threats facing mankind, but by giving the whole world a beautiful vision for the future. Your rail and tunnel project, this seems to have screwed up, but anyway, you could agree, this is in the middle of the paragraph, to build a corridor across the Bering Strait, and with that unite the rail systems of Eurasia with those of the Americas. This project would develop the vast untapped resources of Siberia, as well as the U.S. Arctic resources of oil, gas, precious metals of all kinds, as well as fresh water. And both Siberia and Far East, Russia and in United States, I didn't go into this, have, as Helga once said, almost every element of the periodic table. In the not-so-distant future, one could then travel from the southern tips. Oh, this thing, unfortunately. I'll just get it through here. Then you would go with a tunnel. I'm going to pick up that you would go down to the tips of Argentina and Chile, in Ushuaia, and Puerto Williams, all the way through the Americas, then the Bering Strait, across Eurasia, then with a tunnel under the Strait of Gibraltar, travel all the way through the African continent to the Cape of Good Hope. And that's going to be a united one world. When we do this, it will free our minds, and all the 100 to 10,000 ideas which are percolating, which are no longer constrained by monetarism and by the City of London and Wall Street. People will say, well, if we can build this project, why not build this one? Why not build this one? How about building this one? How about building the things we... And what will happen is when you take the iron mask off, humanity can think. And to me, that's going to be, and think in terms of civilization. And that's going to be the highest achievement of this project.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I think this is very exciting. Hold on one second. Okay.
So I just want to say, I don't mean to imply we don't need to stop nuclear war. That we definitely do. That's an existential threat to mankind. But this will also be the way that you also end nuclear war, and also that you build the process of what really is a war-fighting strategy by a new economic development and security architecture. This will be the core. And as Lynn said, this is the navel of moving this whole process south.
Good. Well, thank you very much. I just find this very exciting because it's clearly the way Americans used to think. And I mean, in terms of transforming the globe and growth, and also those charts about how many people per square mile, there's nobody. And I just, for people who are watching, because we have to be careful, because people have now been programmed so they hear one world and globalist, people react. So let me just be precise. We're not talking about one global order under global governance. We're talking about the fairly obvious, which is when you start connecting places, the planet becomes much smaller and we have to interact. Lyndon LaRouche did say that at some point mankind might move beyond nations. But that is a different idea than what you may be thinking of, the globalists or the World Economic Forum or this kind of nonsense. And there is a value of the diverse religions, cultures, languages, sciences. And I think we will see it in building a project such as this, because Russia comes from, a very different kind of cultural matrix perhaps than the United States in many ways. So there are going to be problems when we start working on together. We're going to benefit immensely from the opportunity to look at things from a different perspective than we might normally.
Absolutely. And I think two things, Diane. Number one, if you think about it, Lynn mentioned in the very beginning of what I quoted, which was also presented at that same conference in April of 2007, which brought together a lot of people, Russia and so forth. And the Chinese were also very acutely, Mr. Meng Su has put together what they could contribute. But people don't really know the Russians. They have, it's a country that has so many different people in it. But the thing is, he keeps mentioning Mendeleev, and he kept mentioning Vernadsky. Now, one, because they're towering thinkers, but he's been reminding the Russians of where they came from. Because when in 1725, the plan of Leibniz to set up the St. Petersburg Academy was finally finalized, it had been posed earlier in the meetings he had with Peter the Great, 1714, 1715, I believe. That brought in Leibnizian science the same way it was brought into the United States in many different ways through Franklin, but also in the formation of our Declaration of Independence. And if you take Leibniz's the Academy, and then you take Lomonosov, you take Mendeleev, you take Vernadsky, There's a huge, rich tradition. They have certain problems, real problems, but it's not an accident that they developed hypersonic missiles before just about everyone. You need to pair the science with the right. They have many science graduates, engineering graduates. They have a whole culture we just don't know. We used to know, and as I said, we never had a war with them. But the other side is, I think this also starts to break the chicken and the egg question, because people say, well, can America do it, or should we have the Chinese come in and build these things for us? No, America should do it. Look, we have about 1.8 million engineers in America. I looked it up. So let's say about half of those are computer engineers and environmental engineers. So you have 900,000 other engineers. And many of them are very, very good. They're very good. But also, if you want to make them better, put them together with the Russians on a challenging project and let them develop.
Right. And also, how long does it take to produce an engineer? I mean, we're looking at projects that may take a decade or two. We don't want to take forever like the Brooklyn Queens Expressway right now, but they're going to be done. It'll be 25 years, for example. I mean, NWAPA, I think that's what Lynn was estimating at the time. So in 25 years, you could have thousands of new engineers coming through the school systems. This will be such a forcing medium for the educational standard, the cultural standard, the optimism. I can say if this project were launched and we started building it for real, I think the drug overdose deaths in the United States would reduce by 50% virtually in 5 years.
I totally agree. I think you would have, I'm just going to take your idea and I think you would produce 100,000 engineers or many, many more. This is the concept that I know is in the back of his mind all the time of our candidate and leader, Jose Vega, because you would put people to work. Let's say you're going to build NWAPA, which when you put it together, and also once you develop Alaska, there's going to be a second generation of Alaska because you're going to now have factories. You're going to have agriculture. You're going to have so many other things. You're going to get a second wave of we're talking about a job, that and all the others, the Bering Strait, literally 10 million jobs in the United States. But you put the youth to work in projects like that. You take them out of whatever place they're in, Bedford-Stuyvesant, wherever. You put them up in a place that they've never been before. And they meet a lot of youth, some from farms, some from Dakotas, some from, Detroit, and you have them start working maybe as not secondary, but labor who learned to apprentice in construction, and they maybe start carrying, LaRouche say, they even learn how to start carrying wood and then how to shape it. And they're taking technical classes at night, what you call junior college classes, and they start to become engineers. But they become it because it's not that they're going to get a degree to please mom and dad, but because they're actually excited and they say, wow, I could build a lot of other things. That's the reason they would do it. And it would take down the drug problem. It would take down, both simultaneously taking down antagonism between nations. It would make real that your identity is productive, that's why you're growing up in America. That's why you're growing up in the South Bronx or in Texas. You've got an identity, and your identity as an American is to build, to construct, to use your mind. And as that identity shifts, you're starting to shift the outlook of the entire population. So I totally agree with you. And the people are a little bit pessimistic, and we both know some who will say, man, I can't do this. It changes. It totally can be changed. And we will. And the diversity question is fantastic because there's a lot of the Russian culture we don't know. There's much of the Chinese culture that almost most Americans don't know. And there are people who, like Jesse Helms, don't want us to know. He's just stupid. But there are higher ups than him. But the thing is, that's the thing. And you'll find that they're exciting people. They're very warm people. Anyone in our organization who's ever met and worked with Chinese people know that they're very warm people. We're presented with like they're mechanical, they just sit and study for tests. It's just so stupid. But
Right.
it's the same thing for Africans. We have geniuses in Africa. We don't know it yet.
Right. Well, some of them we know of, but we're going to know a lot more. So I think it's time to wrap up. Just thank you very much. I would appeal to everyone here. Please like, share, subscribe, donate to the LaRouche organization. By the time this goes off the air, perhaps the meeting will be done. We don't know. The Russians I just saw were saying the meeting itself could go for 6 or 7 hours. So who knows? I hope it is lengthy, and I hope this project gets put on the table. But since we know the next phase, besides the meeting with Zelensky, who's irrelevant, is that President Trump is supposed to be visiting with President Putin in Russia. And hopefully between those times, we will see Putin, Trump, and Xi Jinping together at the end of the War in Pacific, the Pacific celebrations on September 3rd of this year, the 80th anniversary of that in Beijing. So I think there's a great deal that may lift us out of the morass of otherwise really lackluster to horrible policies coming from various policymakers, including our own president. We can get to a new level of thinking and optimism. So thank you very much for joining me.
Oh, thank you for having me. I just want to make one small thing. I also want to say Hal was, of course, very close with Marsha Mary Baker and others too. But yes, thank you. Thank you.
Yes.